Muy buenos días. Sean ustedes bienvenidos a la Cátedra Prebisch 2016. Para dar inicio a esta actividad, tendremos las palabras de la Secretaria Ejecutiva de la CEPAL, señora Alicia Bárcena.
Muy buenos días, queridos amigas y amigos. Antes de iniciar este evento, permítanme extender mis profundas condolencias ante el sensible fallecimiento hace solo unos minutos de don Patricio Aylwin, que fue el primer presidente de la democracia recuperada y por tanto quisiera enviarle a su familia y al pueblo chileno nuestra solidaridad y compañía. Lo recordamos con mucho afecto. Estimadísima Mariana Mazzucato, titular de nuestra Cátedra Prebisch 2016, representantes del Gobierno de Chile, del cuerpo diplomático, de instituciones académicas, nos acompaña nuestro querido rector, muchas gracias por estar aquí, instituciones académicas del Sistema de Naciones Unidas, amigas y amigos. Agradezco en realidad la presencia de todos quienes nos acompañan esta mañana, porque desde 2001 nos damos cita aquí, en este preciso lugar, para honrar la memoria de Raúl Prebisch, a través de esta cátedra que hoy celebra su 14ª sesión. Pero hoy, además de rendirle un homenaje a la vocación del fundador de esta casa por atisbar el pensamiento crítico de quienes desde nuestra región y alrededor del mundo se atrevieron a desafiar convencionalismos, hoy, precisamente hoy, tenemos el gran honor de recibir a Mariana Mazzucato, titular de esta Cátedra 2016, que además es orgullosamente la primera mujer que acude a esta Cátedra Prebisch. Y eso es un gran honor. Además, hoy celebramos los 40 años de nuestra revista CEPAL. Y aquí está Osvaldo Zunkel, ahí está Osvaldo Zunkel, nuestro presidente, porque esta cátedra va a publicarse acá, en la revista de la CEPAL, pero que cumple 40 años. Así es que eso también es una ocasión de celebración. La profesora Mazzucato ha irrumpido en el debate global económico como una voz fresca, clara, rigurosa, armada de datos, y con ello ha desmontado el dispositivo discursivo de la ortodoxia, develando el rol del Estado no como mero corrector de las fallas del mercado, sino como un potente creador de mercados nuevos en la raíz de las revoluciones tecnológicas que configuran el rostro presente y futuro del escenario económico global. La profesora Mazzucato nació en Roma a los 5 años. Migró junto a su familia a Princeton, en Nueva Jersey. Su padre, un destacado físico, a quien le dedica su libro, su gran libro del Estado emprendedor. Y se integró entonces el padre de Mariana a Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, una unidad de investigación de vanguardia realmente del Departamento de Energía de los Estados Unidos. Ahí se formó Mariana, en la casa de un físico. Eso es muy importante. Fue en Estados Unidos donde Mariana recorrió una trayectoria profesional y académica que inicia con estudios de pregrado en el bachillerato en artes, en historia y relaciones internacionales en la Universidad de Tufts en Boston. Continúa su máster y su doctorado en economía en The New School for Social Research de Nueva York. Además, como fellow Marie Curie de investigación, realizó estudios postdoctorales en la London Business School. Pero yo quiero señalar un dato muy significativo para mí, y es que Mariana, siendo muy joven, una joven estudiante precisamente de bachillerato, hizo su minor en estudios latinoamericanos y su junior transcurrió en un intercambio donde estudió economía política en mi universidad, en la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Y ahí, como lo ha dicho la propia Mariana, se desató su fascinación con la economía, y yo diría con la política. Mariana es titular durante desde el 2011 de la Cátedra R.M. Phillips en Economía de la Innovación en el Science Policy Research Unit de la Universidad de Sussex, la misma donde antes ocuparon intelectuales de la talla de Christopher Freeman, Keith Pavitt y Nick von Tusselman. Quisiera aprovechar para mencionar justamente el estrecho vínculo que hay entre CEPAL y la Universidad de Sussex, porque durante los años 90 hicimos diálogos académicos y nos inspiramos mutuamente, fundamentalmente entre Carlota Pérez y Fernando Feinsilber, uno de los autores más destacados de la CEPAL. Y algunos de nuestros funcionarios también han pasado por tal universidad, tales como Joao Carlos Ferraz, como Mario Cimoli, que hoy están con nosotros acompañando este proceso de innovación y políticas públicas. Mazzucato fue profesora de economía en la Universidad de Denver, titular de la Open University, profesora visitante de la Universidad de Bocconi, todos episodios muy notables de una carrera muy destacada en las trincheras de la academia. Pero en fecha reciente también se unió a algo muy importante para nosotros, que es la United Nations University. Y eso me da mucho gusto porque ojalá podamos influir en las Naciones Unidas, tú desde el UNU y yo desde acá, a ver si cambiamos un poco los paradigmas. Pero no solo en las aulas se ha desplegado su interés. La profesora Mazzucato ha tenido una muy fructífera relación con actores claves de la política, porque recién graduada trabajó para el National Labor Committee y el Sindicato de los Trabajadores Textiles y de la Confección de Ropa en Estados Unidos. Ahí su interés por lo público y lo colectivo, porque Mazzucato también es miembro del Consejo de Asesores del Gobierno de Escocia, del Consejo sobre Economía e Innovación del Foro Económico Mundial, es miembro del Grupo de Expertos sobre Innovación de la Comisión Europea, participa en el Comité Asesor Económico del Partido Laborista Británico, The Shadow Cabinet, y ha participado en las deliberaciones del Senado de Estados Unidos para apoyar el proyecto Prosperidad de la Clase Media, impulsada por la senadora Elizabeth Warren. Hace solo días, Mariana estuvo precisamente en Brasil, y hoy estuvimos conversando, y ayer también, de un reporte que le comisionaron en Brasil la presidencia junto con el Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación, que se denomina el Sistema de Innovación Brasileño. Una propuesta con orientación de misión. Interesante. Nos va a explicar qué quiere decir misión. Nuestra invitada fue también la primera y hasta ahora la única receptora del prestigioso premio New Statesman Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute, el SPERI, lanzado bianualmente. Entre otros candidatos también ha estado ahí Ha-Shong Chang, Tomás Piketty y Wolfgang Streeck, pero tú lo ganaste, ellos no. Entonces, pues Mariana, como ustedes pueden ver, ha labrado un gran puente de divulgación entre el debate público, entre el mercado, y ese es el libro y el tema que hoy nos ocupa, que se llama El Estado Emprendedor, mitos del sector público frente al privado. Es una lectura obligada, un esfuerzo valiente y riguroso por explicar el verdadero papel que ha jugado el Estado en el impulso a la innovación, el crecimiento y los mercados. Mariana nos invita de forma persuasiva a comprender las funciones que puede desempeñar tanto el sector público como el privado y lograr lo que ella llama el ecosistema de la innovación. Y si no tenemos la capacidad de reconocer el papel que juega el Estado en el impulso de la innovación, esto puede ser fundamentalmente, y es la poca comprensión del papel del Estado en la innovación, quizás es una de las grandes causas de la disfuncionalidad del capitalismo moderno. Por eso en tu libro de Rethinking Capitalism estoy segura que vas a abordar estos temas y estará pronto en septiembre. Entonces, es el Estado el que toma los riesgos y acomete la fuerza emprendedora líder y lo hace como ella lo explica en su libro, con muchos ejemplos, lo explica con iPhone, con la energía renovable, con los fármacos, y lo hace armada de socios intelectuales que son indispensables para CEPAL, Keynes y Schumpeter. Esa es la obra que hoy Mariana presenta al mundo, bueno, que lo ha presentado desde 2014 y hoy está en proceso otros 2 libros muy importantes, y ella está confrontando precisamente los dogmas de la economía con hechos, datos, historia, en donde muestra que ha sido el animal spirit del sector público el verdadero componente dinámico de las innovaciones tecnológicas. Reivindica la noción de Estado desarrollista, develando cómo este carácter describe la naturaleza y presencia del sector público en potencias económicas de hoy, como Estados Unidos, Alemania, Japón y China. Nos narra cómo la única ruta al desarrollo supone que el Estado y las agencias del mercado realmente desplieguen una potente política industrial. Así es de que de eso se trata. También en su libro acomete otra tarea muy interesante, que es la denuncia de cómo grandes empresas privadas recompran acciones, recurren a diversos mecanismos contables para pagar menos impuestos y no le devuelven a la sociedad la inversión, por lo tanto, frenan el proceso de innovación desde el principio. La innovación, nos dice Mariana, es un proceso colectivo, incierto y acumulativo. Y como en una primera etapa es tan incierto, los privados, generalmente con esa visión cortoplacista, no lo ven como un atractivo económico y por lo tanto no asignan los recursos a este tipo de sectores con horizontes de retorno de largo plazo. Así es que el debate que nos propone Mariana, y la vamos a escuchar, nos invita a mirar el valor de los ecosistemas de innovación, las alianzas virtuosas entre actores públicos y privados, y es un debate de economía política, en verdad, que nos permite tener una mirada renovada de la ecuación Estado, mercado y sociedad. En este marco, yo diría, el desafío realmente de la economía heterodoxa es doble, porque por un lado, hablar de política económica y sus instrumentos como ejes de intervención pública para el desarrollo, también debe dar cuenta de otro tema muy relevante, que es la dimensión institucional. No quiero adelantar más porque vamos a escuchar los argumentos de la propia Mariana, pero sí les quiero contar solamente una cosa más, y es que Mariana nos va a acompañar también en el periodo de sesiones de la CEPAL en mayo próximo. Y nosotros, como ustedes saben, desde el 2010 inauguramos una senda de reflexión con la igualdad en el centro. La hora de la igualdad, cambio estructural, pactos para la igualdad, pactos, deals, y ahora nos vamos hacia un tema que se llama Horizontes 2030 con la igualdad en el centro del desarrollo sostenible. Y ahí lo que estamos diciendo es que mucho de lo que tú también dices, Mariana, que la falta de demanda agregada coexiste con un exceso de liquidez, que el sistema financiero está siguiendo una trayectoria autoalimentada de multiplicación de activos con grandes desequilibrios en la cuenta corriente y emisión de títulos de deuda, que se acentúa el despegue del mundo de las finanzas, del mundo de la producción, el desacople, la financiarización de la economía. Y este potencial disruptivo de una riqueza financiera que se incrementa con velocidad y que excede la producción y el comercio. Entonces, nosotros también estamos analizando esto y vemos cómo la irrupción de China, los megaacuerdos, el cambio demográfico, la crisis ambiental, la revolución tecnológica y sobre todo la gran desaceleración económica y comercial que nos está llevando a este estancamiento secular de la economía mundial exige de verdad alinear nuestra trayectoria de desarrollo con otras aspiraciones, con algo que tú le has llamado la misión. Y por eso, como se hizo explícito en el Acuerdo de París de Cambio Climático, la humanidad hoy se encuentra ante un punto de no retorno. El impacto ambiental del estilo dominante pone en riesgo la supervivencia de la humanidad y de otras especies. Por eso, esta realidad nos exige movernos hacia senderos de crecimiento bajos en carbono y que no se dará, y ahí es donde tu término para mí es sensacional, sin un ecosistema de innovación verde, que sea simbiótico y no parasitario, y que exige un paquete de inversiones de tecnologías limpias que mitiguen el cambio climático y nos den un gran impulso ambiental. Pero esto se necesita que haya una acción coordinada y simultánea por parte de los países y de los actores públicos y privados. Todos podemos encontrar una respuesta, quizás, pero solo si actuamos en conjunto hacia un gran impulso ambiental, que es la contrapartida natural a un keynesianismo ambiental global. Así es de que esa es la importancia que nosotros le damos a lo que hoy Mariana nos va a contar. Eso, y por ello, como tú nos insinúas en tus trabajos recientes, la CEPAL considera que los objetivos y desafíos ambientales nos abren una gran oportunidad para una transformación tecnológica y productiva que sea la base de la generación de empleos de calidad, de mayor crecimiento, de más igualdad. Y voy a citar a Carlota Pérez, que en tu libro en español te hace el prólogo. Y Carlota dice, el Estado y los políticos deben superar el miedo a la acción del gobierno y a diseñar las políticas atrevidas que puedan generar crecimiento y recuperar el bienestar para todos. Queridos amigas y amigos, querida Mariana, bienvenuta. Primero que nada, es un enorme gusto en que te reitero nuestra gratitud por tu presencia y te invito a hacer uso de la palabra como la titular de la 14ª Cátedra Prebisch de la CEPAL. Muchas gracias.
Wow, that was a very, very good introduction. One of those introductions where then the speaker comes to the table and feels like I have to match the introduction to make sure you're as excited as the introducer. So first of all, what an honor to follow the footsteps of Ocampo, Cardozo, Stiglitz, Roderick in this cátedra, and of course to be the first woman, hopefully the first of many. I recently got my hair cut and I was called sir 3 times on my way over in the airplane. Sir, would you like some coffee? Anyway, I am a woman with short hair. And it's also a real honor because I do feel that what I'll be talking about is very much in the line of continuity of what Prebisch was talking about, in terms of we have choices to be made in terms of the terms of trade, not just in terms of the structural composition of the economy, which sectors produce more absolute advantage and all those dynamics that were so critical in his work, which, by the way, I don't think have been picked up enough on. Someone like Nathan Rosenberg actually did in a great article where he talked about the very different types of advantages around innovation and the dynamic returns to scale in capital-intensive areas versus labor-intensive. But Prebisch's message, I don't think, didn't influence enough my community, Schumpeterian evolutionary scholars, so I hope that perhaps I can help make that transition. But I want to be focusing, again, in the line of continuity of this issue of we need to make strategic choices in terms of the terms of trade for another type of issue of the terms, the deals that we can be striking between public and private actors precisely to render the kinds of public-private partnerships that are so needed today, dynamic partnerships, in order to confront the big, if you want, societal/technological challenges of the day, whether they be the challenges around the green economy and climate change, whether they be around the challenges around youth unemployment, the demographic challenges, and of course the big challenges that Piketty talked to us all about in terms of inequality. We can only do this through public-private partnerships, but if we don't have a proper theory of the public side, those partnerships become quite problematic and actually also nurture the same problem we're trying to solve. So anyway, thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you also to Antonio Prado, to Mario Cimoli, and all of your wonderful CEPAL team who made this possible and who interacted with me a lot between the last months and actually arriving here. So let me just begin by saying that we're actually living through a wonderful moment where there's lots of discussion, at least, about the kinds of policies that we need to confront the big challenges of the day around smart, innovation-led growth, around sustainable growth, around inclusive growth. This is good, of course, because for many years, when growth for growth's sake was the agenda, We had growth in the 1990s, but those were precisely the years, for example, that Piketty shows us inequality skyrocketed. So actually defining the kinds of growth that we need is quite critical. The problem is that the kinds of frameworks that we have to guide policy making remain very sort of trapped in narrow ways of talking about the public sector's role, which Alicia already mentioned. But so why do I call this narrow? Because it's really just about fixing different types of problems, whether those problems are arising from system failures, which we know there's lots of, or market failures, which economists talk about all the time. Those types of failures exist, but to actually tackle these societal challenges which I just mentioned, and of course which CEPAL and other UN and other transnational organizations are trying to tackle, whether that can actually be done with a framework that is just about putting bandages here and there, or fundamentally rethink that framework, I think is the issue, and that's what I really want to focus on. Is this moving? There we go. And personally, I've been very inspired by the work of Carlo Polanyi and his work on the Great Transformation, precisely because he, from the outset, actually talks about policy in terms of, a very different framework, which is about market shaping and market creating in the diverse set of policies which actually had to be in existence for the capitalist national market to even emerge, right? So local and international markets have been actually around for thousands of years, but the national capitalist market, which is recent, it's about 300 years old, was actually in some ways forced into existence through different types of policies. And then, of course, the work of John Maynard Keynes, who I think has also been not so much misunderstood, but not taken advantage of enough by modern-day Keynesians. Joan Robinson talked about the bastardized Keynesians, interesting concept, because Keynes wasn't actually just about counter-cyclical investment. It wasn't that you just needed the state to come in with the bandage to deal with the pro-cyclical private sector, which invested too much in the boom, too little in the bust, and so the government had to correct that. He also had this idea of doing big things, doing interesting, meaningful, high-impact things through different types of government policy. And this quote from The End of Laissez-Faire is great, where he says, policy should not be just about tinkering on the sidelines, but about making big things happen that would not have happened anyway. And the fact that we continue to frame this thing about, what would not have happened anyway, just in terms of market failures, like the fact that private sector doesn't invest enough in basic research, so government has to come in and solve that problem, is a real problem, right? That we stick to that framework, and that even the modern-day Keynesians today don't necessarily, in my opinion, have a proper theory of the state in the boom, right? Is it just in the bust that we need these counter-cyclical measures, or what does it mean to actually talk about growth in terms of its rate, but also its direction? And what are the different types? Are those birds? That's pretty cool. Wow. Okay. The rate and direction of growth. Innovation as well, by the way, has both a rate and a direction. And thinking about a diverse set of policies, both direct and indirect, which tilt the playing field, don't level the playing field in this direction that perhaps we as a society in different countries want. Now, apologies for this self-promotional slide, but when your book is translated in German as Das Kapital, it's actually nice to just see it there, because I doubt it'll ever happen again. But the capital of the state, how interesting is a concept, and perhaps we can come back to that at the end when I deal with this issue of risks and rewards and building mutualistic, symbiotic ecosystems and partnerships versus, say, the predator-prey, parasitic kind that no one benefits in the long run. And so what I tried to do in this book, which was really to build on wonderful work in people who've been looking at the developmental state, the developmental network state as well, so Peter Evans, Fred Block, as well as, of course, building on the work, as I already mentioned, of Carlo Polanyi, but to really then apply it to the most modern forms of capitalism that we have all these wonderfully trendy words to talk about. So the new economy, the information society, the importance of intangible capital. I'm not making fun of those words, by the way. I just mean that we like to talk about those things, but then we go back to a really boring theory of public policy within that. So what is the role of the state in this Polanyi-esque sense of market shaping, market creating, in the Keynesian sense of doing big, interesting things? He even got the artists involved in the post-crash investments in the US. What does that mean for when we are actually approaching these challenges, for example, smart, innovation-led growth? And especially, and sorry, I put this slide up sometimes in my presentation because it took so long to make a Prezi presentation. I've never done it again. But what I try to do this in this slide is to say that what we first must do from the beginning, but also in the end, is to completely dismantle a prejudice that many of us have, as intelligent as we think we are, where we often think, yes, of course the state is important, of course the Tea Party is wrong to think it's not important, but it's just there to de-risk, to facilitate, one of the words I find most problematic, facilitate, to administer, to create these background fundamental framework conditions so that the really cool guys can do their thing. Right? So the cool guys, meaning Zuckerberg and all the Silicon Valley types, but also each nation will have their cool private sector entrepreneurs versus the necessary but boring, lethargic, inertial state, right? And to actually, in a provocative way, what I'd like to do is also in some ways to reverse that cartoon image, but also to fundamentally ask who it's serving, who is being served by this, this image. And especially, I mean, and this is ongoing work, which I'm doing with other people, especially different postdocs that I've been hiring through different grants, including from the Ford Foundation project on reforming global governance, to think of different spaces where one might look at, whether it's the space of space, literally. NASA was very interested in what they can learn in terms of setting up new partnerships with the Elon Musks of this world who use the space station, but also really, and this is my big interest, and hopefully we can work together, we've been talking about this today, to actually really build a useful, policy-oriented, new theoretical framework that can ask very, very different questions when we, not just in crisis periods, but in general, are trying to build these different types of partnerships. And as Hirschman said, and I think this is very, very important, that the success of a theory consists in that suddenly everyone begins to reason according to very different categories, very different images, hopefully very different language, right? So I don't like the word de-risk or facilitate, because if we're talking about difficult challenges, why should we facilitate? Let's, take on the difficulties together. Let's share the risks. Let's co-invest. That's very different from the outset, even visually, but also in terms of the discourse, and I'm not a postmodernist. I don't know enough about postmodernism, but they do talk about discourse, and this is important. How we talk about things matters. In philosophy, there's a concept of performativity. How you talk about something also then affects the actions of different agents, how we judge them in terms of their performance, and that feeds back into how we talk about them. So we better make sure we're talking about things in interesting ways if we want interesting policies to come about. And what I will be focusing on are these sort of, I don't want to call them categories because that would be giving them too much importance, but different types of questions that can also challenge the existing discourse, but also present us, not just with a question, but some concrete ways to arrive to very different answers in terms of how we've been building these different types of relationships to achieve the kind of smart, innovation-led growth, but also with the hope that that will become more sustainable growth and especially more inclusive growth. So I will just quickly tell you what these are, so you have them in your head as we go through them. And I do have my iPhone here to make sure that I will stop at exactly 45 minutes. But I think it's useful to have the global picture from the beginning. So first, I want to challenge this constant obsession which paralyzes many policymakers about the fear of being accused of picking winners. I want to talk about how basically everything of interest that has happened in modern day capitalism has been a result of choices, decisions, certain actions being picked and other actions not being picked. And what does this mean in terms of the directionality of the system? As I said before, growth and innovation have both a rate and a direction. So let's embrace this issue about directionality, but of course always with being aware that the real issue is how to learn from the interesting areas of the world and experiences also at the organizational level where these choices were made also in quite broad ways, in visionary ways, in mission-oriented ways, so that the picking doesn't just become serving one particular firm, one particular technology, one particular sector, but galvanizing interesting relationships which can actually approach all the different homework problems, which might then have how do you say, entail making those choices on specific firm sectors and technologies, but all geared to solving a big challenge, a problem, what I'll call a mission. And I'll give you some examples. Second, because that actually requires being able to have visions and dream and experience the difficult process of policymaking, what Hirschman called policy as process, taking risks, welcoming change, welcoming trial and error, and the serendipity that, that it entails, how to build public organizations that actually, again, embrace exploration, that welcome failure, but also think about the potential failures and how to get big impact from the successes in interesting, dynamic ways. So, for example, through interesting public-oriented portfolio management. How to assess a strategic, mission-oriented, courageous type of public policy. If the point is to shape and create markets, we better have indicators in place that are going to be able to, that will be able to evaluate those policies and not fall back to the constant, easy kind of de facto accusation that any agency, organization, or ministry that is going beyond fixing just the public good is seen as crowding out the private sector. Of course, there are instances of crowding out, but we better make sure that our analysis is at least being derived from the right objective function. If the objective function is creating and shaping markets in a dynamic way that fosters long-run value creation, that should have concrete implications for the indicators that we have to evaluate and assess those policies. And lastly, as I've already said, doing all this requires taking great risks, also failing along the way. So how to rethink the whole issue around risks and rewards so that we are not just asking the public sector to socialize the risks with taxpayer funds or even money created, as my Minskians always tell me. They always say, don't just focus on taxpayer funds, government can create money. But let's just ignore that just for a minute. How we can ask the public sector to not just socialize the risks, but also the rewards. And what are the interesting experiments around the world that are actually being used today to do that? And all these, I hope, really do engage us with a new type of conversation. And very conveniently, the first letter spells roar, which is about actually, thinking in the animal spirits kind of way that Keynes told us to. How do we actually get private sector investment to really increase and to co-invest alongside the state so business is willing to roar and co-invest and share the risks and the rewards. So let me start with the first, which is this issue around directionality, and I'll be appealing to some examples both in the book, but as well as some more recent work I've been doing, for example, on public banks, which are today really leading in some ways the climate finance area, which is not just about R&D, but also deploying and diffusing the existing also renewable energy capacity so that we have a greater trajectory towards the green growth. So the first point is just quite simple. The technologies that actually matter, so not just going from an iPhone 4 to an iPhone 5, but actually those technologies and big technological changes, which we sometimes call general purpose technologies, they're really hard to even talk about or to look at historically in terms of just having had policy which fixed a system failure or a market failure. What they all actually required, both in terms of their emergence, but also their deployment and diffusion, which actually then allowed those technologies to have a real impact on production, distribution, and also consumption, required this, again, market-shaping policies across the whole innovation and production change on both the supply side and the demand side. I often appeal to examples in the US, not because the US is in any way more important than any other country, but simply because the Silicon Valley example continues to be sort of symbolically and also metaphorically what people are appealing to. In the UK, we have Silicon Roundabout. You can imagine why. But many countries, including my own Italy, they go to Silicon Valley when they want to do smart growth, and the real question is what was learned in those experiences. Did Renzi really learn what happened in Silicon Valley when he came back to Italy and introduced the Jobs Act, which is all about labor market rigidities, which has nothing to do with Silicon Valley's miracle. Anyway, don't get me started on Renzi. Right, so the first point is that the kinds of investments that got us the Googles, the Facebooks, the internet, if we actually go to the organizations which co-invested alongside the private sector, they were very much taking risks, delving into the uncertain world of innovation across the whole innovation chain. This was not just about fixing the public good, basic research, blue sky science problem, as important as that is. It was also financing the applied research, also financing the early stage financing of companies themselves, so choices made, picking particular companies. Intel, Compaq, and Apple all got very early stage money from different types of public public funding schemes downstream. In-Q-Tel, you might know, is the CIA's big public venture capital fund, which might worry you, but it's interesting how little is known about it. But the SBIR program, Small Business Innovation and Research Program, ARPA-E, which today is trying to replicate the kind of dynamism that was inside DARPA, which of course was hugely responsible for ARPANET and then the internet. The point here is simply to say they are distributed across the whole innovation chain. Let me see where we're going. And what's interesting, if you look at, again, the kinds of finance that actually came out, so the National Institutes of Health, 32 billion a year, or 31 billion a year was what was spent in 2012, even after sequestration. And it has actually been almost bipartisan. This is the first time in US history, by the way, that these kinds of funding has been challenged by, let's just call it the Tea Party kind of atmosphere. It's not just the Tea Party, of course, but this challenge to big thinking government. But even Reagan increased the budgets of the NIH, which has been found to be responsible for something like 75% of the most innovative new drugs, so new molecular entities with priority rating. The Small Business Innovation Research Program that I mentioned before, what's interesting about that graph is it looks at the difference between public and private VC and shows that these kinds of public funds from, for example, the SBIR, if anything, have become even more important in the US. Why? Because so much venture capital is exit-driven. They want returns to happen in 3 or 5 years, when even the Death Valley stage in the middle of that innovation chain I showed you before can last even 10 years. Now, what's interesting, as I already mentioned, there's also different types of public banks around the world. Not so many, because there are lots of public banks, but not all have been willing to engage with this, let's call it mission-oriented types of policies around innovation. And BNDES in Brazil, KfW in Germany, the China Development Bank, and the European Investment Bank have, for example, been leading in financing the green, if you want, innovation challenge across that whole chain, but focusing in this particular instance more on the deployment and diffusion. Now, this is interesting, of course, because if you look at the KfW numbers there, but also the BNDES numbers, these are, again, 2 public banks, they are not just counter-cyclical, which is great, right? That was Keynes's first point, that when private banks are retreating, the public bank steps in, but they're also directing this finance in a particular way. it says there that this KfW money has been absolutely fundamental to help the German government to direct its Energiewende policy, which is not just about renewable energy, it's absolutely about steering the green agenda across many different sectors. And this is really what I mean by mission. What is a mission? So going to the moon was a mission, and they knew also when they got there, so it was a concrete mission, but it was broader than just, a list of sectors. So going to the moon required dozens of different sectors, including clothing, to get together and to, if you want, co-invest alongside government across these different homework problems, which eventually got us to the moon. Some say we never got there, but let's just not get into conspiracy theories. But what's interesting, again, is do we have, and I'll come to this in a minute, do we actually have frameworks that can really understand this kind of directionality in public programs? And I think the answer is no. This is my usual example, which I won't delve into because I think anyone who's heard me is probably bored of this. But, the iPhone, the reason that it's smart is because of what you can do with it. And all those technologies which today make all our products smart products, not just the iPhone, smart products and not dumb products, are in fact results of this kind of direct spending, right? This is not indirect through tax incentives. This was different organizations across, again, the whole innovation chain directly making things happen that would not have happened anyway, which then end up in our smart products, which of course we need intelligent companies like Apple then to put together those technologies in very cool ways. And design is important. Development is important. But dismissing this kind of directional risk-taking that different organizations have had to delve into in order for these smart technologies to come about isn't very helpful to then building interesting innovation policies. And this is just interesting because Alice Amsden wrote a very interesting article in the CEPAL review of Zunkel, who told me today that it's the 40th anniversary. Alicia mentioned that as well. She wrote an article on Prebisch lives in Asia. And many of the examples she gives about Taiwan, this article was focused on Taiwan, very much are the kinds of policies that, in fact, we also had in the part of the world that we all think was market-led in Silicon Valley. So she talks about from the old economy to the new economy using spin-offs from state-owned research institutes and public labs. Yes, the US still has public labs. In Europe, we don't. Together with different types of policy tools, which we're actually trying to then inspire and increase, if you want, private sector investment. But those indirect mechanisms, indirectly just creating tax incentives, would not have had the effect they did had they not been also accompanied by these more direct measures, which are actually increasing, again, the animal spirits of the private sector, making them recognize a new area of investment which simply did not exist before. And that does require quite a bit of not just risk-taking, but dreams, as Kennedy called them, and willingness to imagine new landscapes. So today, in some ways, we have a crisis of imagination. With Carlota Perez, we've been writing about what it actually means to bring these kinds of discussions to the center of how we even think about economic growth. We wrote a paper recently called Innovation as Growth Policy, reflecting on this whole issue of tilting the playing field. But her work continues to be fundamental in reminding all of us that the kinds of courageous, strategic, mission-oriented policies should not just be about financing, if you want, the innovations, but also really radically rethinking the demand policies. She points to, for example, mass production as big revolution, of course, technological revolution, which would not have had the effect it did have all over the world in terms of, again, production and distribution, had it not also had different types of demand pull policies like suburbanization. Right, suburbanization, which came out of policies, people didn't just wake up and want to go to the suburbs, actually allowed mass production to have a direction, and she uses that to reflect on how to rethink green policies beyond renewable energy and to think of them also as a redirection of IT, right? So Solow and also Robert Gordon, who like to say, to point to the indoor toilet in some ways as having had more effect on people's lives than the internet. One of the issues they're raising is, have we really used IT to its full potential? And really the answer to that, it shouldn't just be, to make these kind of comparisons between the toilet and the internet, but to rethink what it would actually mean to provide a direction for the IT revolution and to think of green as one of the key directions for that. And that is, in fact, to be fair, I think partly what Germany is trying to do through its Energiewende policy. So let's move on to the second point, and I will become quicker, on what this actually implies for building the organizations in the public sector, different areas of the public sector, health, education, those areas that are thinking of the digital economy, but even public broadcasting, so television and radio, in order to actually approach these missions, which again, as I said, require specific choices, decisions to be made, and to actually welcome that very difficult process. Why do I say difficult? Because most new big things require lots of trial and error. Trial, trial, and trial, error, error, and error, and then success appears. And how to actually welcome that trial and error process as opposed to fear it. And this, again, coming back to these missions that I mentioned before, if you actually look at the websites just of the organizations that have been so central to both the IT revolution, but again, today looking at the green revolution and the ARPA-Es or the KFWs of this world, they don't describe themselves as fixing different types of failures, whether it's system failures. Is that how the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany describe their role? Is that how NASA sees its role in space? Or BNDES in terms of achieving the kind of smart, innovation-led, also inclusive growth that Brazil has been very much after? We'll see what happens, but in the last 10 years, no, just look at their websites. They're very, forthcoming in terms of wanting to actually create these new landscapes, whether it's in life sciences, space, or tackling the digital agenda. I think I just got the BNDES one. No, where was it? I added one this morning. Oh, the BBC, which I'll show you in the next slide, but also BNDES, to foster sustainable and competitive development in the Brazilian economy, generating employment while reducing social and regional inequalities. And then you look at all the different portfolios of funding that they have had in order to tackle that competitive challenge. And of course, there's been very concrete choices to have made in terms of how to, again, tilt the playing field in Brazil towards a particular kind of growth. And it doesn't move for some reason. There we go. The BBC is quite interesting because they're very clear. They say, hold on, that's very small for me to see. Oh God, it's even smaller on my slides. They say that we want to be one of the most creative organizations in the world. Okay? What this has actually meant has been not only producing great news, which we all probably in this room are constantly watching, as well as great programs, but also investing in its own capabilities and capacities. This is really crucial because one of the biggest cancers I think we have today in modern capitalism is precisely because we don't recognize this market shaping, market creating, risk taking, lead investor, investor first resort kind of role. Then we have also increasingly outsourced the brains of different public organizations. And so when it's fine to outsource catering. If you start outsourcing those areas that are creating new knowledge in your organization, that does then affect your absorptive capacity, a concept, by the way, that we tend to only use for the private sector. The public sector has to nurture its absorptive capacity. So what the BBC has done over the decades has been to invest even in its own IT skills, which were important both for the BBC Micra, one of the first personal computers even before IBM's, which wasn't necessarily then a success on the market, but the spillovers were massive from that, and there's lots of studies within their sector on measuring the creative economy that have looked at those spillovers. But also more recently, the iPlayer, which is one of the most innovative platforms in the world for public broadcasting, which also benefits other private broadcasters who have been able to benefit from that. But that, sort of goes beyond this remit of just the public good for the BBC, create a documentary about giraffes in Africa. In fact, they are often attacked of crowding out the private broadcasters. Today, there's a charter review happening in Britain, and I really encourage you to look. Whether you want to access it through the newspaper articles or actually go into the BBC website, you'll see the kind of debates that they're having. They're being accused of crowding out the private broadcasters, and this will bring me to my next slide, because we don't actually have proper measurements, the next point, measurements to actually capture what the BBC has done. So it gets accused of, why are you doing soap operas? Why are you doing talk shows? Why are you investing in this technology and not outsourcing it? Well, precisely because it's mission-oriented, precisely because it knows that to attract great talent, right? People matter. People will find it an honor to work in the BBC if it does have these missions. And in fact, this has been one of the secrets also to the US government, where these mission-oriented organizations have actually been very successful in bringing in some top thinkers. The Department of Energy was recently directed by Steve Chu, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist directing as a civil servant the Department of Energy. And under Obama's stimulus program in 2009, he was very much part of steering the stimulus in the green direction, and in fact founded ARPA-E in 2009 precisely in order to increase the public sector capacity in terms of directed green kinds of investments. But do you think that a Nobel Prize-winning physicist would want to work in a Department of Energy or Department of Innovation or Department of Health if the message was we are there to de-risk, to leverage, to create these background conditions for then the interesting things to happen in the private sector? Indeed, ARPA-E just this month came out with a huge innovation in battery storage that both Bill Gates and Elon Musk were going after as well. And you know, great success story, but along the way they also had many failures. And again, understanding better, and this is where we really should be looking across the world, to the YOSMAs in Israel, to the DARPAs in the US, to the BNDSs, and how they've been able to attract top economists who can then think about these kind of portfolio issues in public organizations which see their role as creating something completely new, not just fixing something existent. In some work we did around this, we actually organized a big conference, and there were some great quotes by some papers that we asked public leaders to write, and Cheryl Martin, who was the now ex-director of ARPA-E, she was very clear. She said, we measure our success by how many risks we have been willing to take with their inevitable failures, and whether the successes, they just might be 1 out of 7 investments, actually matter. There's really interesting things to learn in that statement, and actually to use them to rethink our understandings of these kind of active organizations, both in terms of how they frame the risks, what kind of risks, but also how to measure the rewards, which again I'll get back to later. And this really does, I think, have huge implications which haven't been thought about enough, but they have been thought about. So of course Hirschman's work in terms of policy as process, and his constant attempt to get the policymaking process to welcome and to embrace the serendipity and what he called the open-ended, eclectic, skeptical inquiry, his concept of the hiding hand as being very important to the policymaking process to be dynamic, flexible, and even use some crises for tackling new opportunities. But of course also in the work of Dick Nelson and Sidney Winter in evolutionary economics, they always, really focus on the organizations, public or private. This is not about public or private. This is any kind of organization that wants to delve into the uncertain world of innovation has to welcome the exploration and trial and error and the learning process, and have the patience also to learn. This is also, by the way, why patient finance is important. Long-term patient finance is important because it gives us time to learn, time to do the trial and error and to learn from the errors. Whereas impatient finance doesn't let us learn. Assessment, how to evaluate public sector market creating investments that are actually explicitly, again, just look at the website statements, pushing market frontiers as opposed to working within ones, and even going beyond the traditional framework we have of crowding out versus crowding in. In fact, the kinds of investments I've been talking about, by creating a new market, we're in some ways dynamizing in, not just crowding in. The concept of crowding in is useful, and of course it's very important, especially when we're looking at multiplier kinds of processes, but they don't necessarily capture, the framework doesn't necessarily capture this creation of something completely new. I don't know why it's, there we go. And Keynes, again, as I said, he's been misunderstood, and there's so many nice quotes that one can find. This was a wonderful letter he wrote to Roosevelt. I think in some ways this letter captures this whole issue of what it is we should be trying to measure. He says, lots of these businesses that we're trying to get to invest are actually not wolves or tigers or lions. They're domesticated animals. So gerbils and hamsters and pussycats. And so in terms of the policy priority and also then the policy evaluation mechanisms, this is quite important, because it's very different if you have a cage with a lion inside, which is the business sector, and you think your role is simply to take away the impediments, lowering tax, get rid of the red tape, or again, de-risking in different types, versus admitting that what you have is a pussycat, and what your goal is to actually turn that pussycat into a lion. This is why in the cover of the first edition of my book I put a lion and a pussycat to actually reflect on this quote of Keynes. And we should have then measurements of the degree we have or have not been able to raise these pussycats into lions. That's one of the first really big evaluation criteria, and also to make sure it goes beyond the crowding in. And one way to do this, for example, we were talking about this yesterday, is we do have through the OECD, which remarkably has great data but doesn't always do great things with it, in terms of, again, changing the narrative, changing the discourse, we have plenty of information on these direct versus indirect mechanisms that policymakers use. And what's interesting is, of course we need both. We need both direct investments as well as incentives that create marginal increases in behavior. But the kinds of lessons we can learn, if you want, by looking at different countries and the distribution of direct and indirect mechanisms. The indirect tax incentives mechanisms here for business R&D is the blue line, direct is gray, is that the indirect mechanisms, first of all, should be designed smartly and not stupidly. Most are designed pretty badly. For example, aimed at the profits that are earned from R&D or patents versus the research that leads to it, right? The point of policymakers is not to increase profits, but to increase investments. But also this distribution of the direct and indirect, where actually what we have is that some of the countries that have the highest business R&D spend, which is quite low in many countries, are precisely those where you've had these different types of public institutions which created a new landscape, creating additionality, making the business sector do what it wouldn't have done anyway, and then, of course, design different types of indirect mechanisms which might affect the marginal decision. I've just realized that. I've been talking so fast that translators probably hate me. But anyway, hopefully most of you speak English. Anyway, so this is very important. So how to really get that additionality measure, which unfortunately many indicators haven't been able to do because we haven't been able to capture, oops, what have I done? This here, which is, again, coming back to the issue before about different bandages that we use for market failures. This is not just about expanding an existing market, but actually also creating something new. So whether it was a national nanotech initiative or different health organizations which may be fostering not just, say, research that leads to medicines, but rethinking completely the definition of the health market. For example, steering investments not just, again, towards medicines, but diagnostics or lifestyle. There's so little money going into serious research around lifestyle. So this is also one of the priorities, which is we should be quite hard on public sector agencies. We should evaluate them, but precisely in some ways the opposite of how they're evaluated. Have you really been able and willing to take the kind of risks which redefine the market rather than take the market as it's currently defined by big companies, say the big pharmaceutical companies, and within that doing your great radical things which they are less willing to do? Why not also redefine the market in ways which might be uncomfortable also for the pharmaceutical companies in the short term, but in the long run you will have also benefited them by creating this new landscape. Maybe the profits today aren't very high if you're funding lifestyle changes, but perhaps just like with many of the green investments over time, these investments that are today not earning great rewards, precisely if they're able to dynamize, for example, new relationships between manufacturing and services and create new areas, will also benefit the same players who see these as threats. So, all sorts of uncomfortable questions. So is it right to tell the BBC it shouldn't make soap operas? What if we all of a sudden actually had evaluation mechanisms which, instead of just having the concept of, that comes from public choice theory and market failure theory, the public good, actually open that up to something called public values, which used to be actually quite debated. It's been decades that we, as economists, haven't been also nurturing that concept and using it also for the policy-making criteria that I've been talking about. Can we get better indicators of how public banks are or are not doing what private banks should be doing. So precisely when you have a dysfunctional private sector, it might, like in private banking in some countries, you might also have the public banking system end up doing what the private banking system should be doing, and instead of continuing down that path, allow the public banks to actually really do what they should be doing, which is transform the market frontier, not just take the place of inertial companies, but actually also insist through different deals, which I'll mention in a minute, that the private companies do what they need to do. I've already mentioned health. Concord is one of the biggest classic failures. It's amazing, if you actually look at that literature, how little was done to try to capture the spillovers that occurred from those Concord investments. Just like I mentioned, the BBC Micra, computer that none of us use. But the point of these public investments is not necessarily to get a plane that flies. Obviously, that was a concern and wouldn't have been great for the commercialization to remain a success. But we need, because these are public investments being driven by a notion of public value or social value or broader concept of the public good, we need to have ways that we actually capture the kinds of spillovers that come from those kinds of investments before we immediately call them failures. And do we have also in the macroeconomy better measures for how to capture the multiplier effect, literally the Keynesian multiplier, when the kind of stimuluses that we are looking for and have seen in the countries that have been quite successful at this smart innovation-led growth required a directed stimulus? Do we have knowledge about the difference between multipliers when they are results of directed spend versus what Keith Pavitt called pissing in the wind, which is probably not very proper to say here, but he was a big thinker and he had my chair before me. So, you know, spreading these investments so thinly across the economy to level the playing field versus, again, tilting it. Moving on. I don't know why this keeps stopping. Is it blocked? Yeah? Is there an IT guy? I mean, I can keep talking. I don't need it. And so the next one, is there someone who can make this go forwards? Here we go. Yeah, so I recommend you look at the work of Bozeman, by the way, who's rethinking the whole notion of public value. But this, to me, is one of the key areas that we need to have adequate public policy. We need adequate also rethinking of the objective function and realize how the whole public choice revolution of the 80s ended up forming this notion of public good investments. And of course, that came from a much older literature by Arrow and others, but it was in some ways captured. And the public good today is not a public good. It's in some ways a public bad because of how narrow it's become. Okay, I don't know why this is not moving. Maybe the IT guy can come and do it himself. And anyway, let's move on now to risks and rewards, which is the next slide, which won't come on. And ask, what can we actually learn? And I don't have much time, so I'll be a bit quick about this, and perhaps we can focus the questions on it, which is how exactly might we form these more interesting, not just relationships, but also conceptualizations, and think of the investments in the context of a revolving fund, where we're not just, as I mentioned before, thinking that the public role is to socialize the risks, but also think creatively of new ways to share in the rewards. This is the most obvious example. I won't read out the whole thing, but in the pharmaceutical industry worldwide, we have the situation where there's lots of public money going into both the supply and the demand side in terms of public purchase of drugs, and yet the prices, if you want, of the drugs haven't been negotiated to reflect that collective wealth creation process. In fact, what's really curious about this in the US is it's in the law. The Bayh-Dole Act, which in 1980 allowed publicly funded research to be patented, actually has in the act, right, this was an act that tried to get commercialization, the notion that the government should have the right to cap the prices of those drugs that are highly publicly funded. The government has never exercised that right. So, you know, the first challenge is even to get these interesting decentralized network of public actors to work in a mission-oriented way. But the second part of that is to give them the confidence to then negotiate the kind of deals that reflect that kind of public investment and high risks and inevitable failures that they will have had to delve in order to even get these successes. And so it's especially problematic in the pharmaceutical industry, not only. So in some work I did with Lazonic, and I'm continuing now in different ways, it's really about rethinking the whole risk-reward concept. it's critical to remember that innovation is cumulative. So if you think of the integral under that curve, right, it's path-dependent, it's persistent, it's cumulative. The integral under that curve can be quite large, and unless we have a new way to talk about wealth creation, the risk is that we then allow certain actors who are able to position themselves in a very confident way as the lead risk takers, the lead innovators, perhaps halfway through that timeline, but then capture a very big portion of that integral beyond what they actually put in. And I think there's lots of different examples one can learn from in terms of how that happened, whether it's in the venture capital industry, whether it's in the corporate governance mechanisms, and how we have, again, narrated a story told certain stories about some actors being more risk takers than others. And very much, I take Piketty's challenge to really rethink the kinds of policies we might need to decrease inequality. Piketty's solution in his book is really, in some ways, to rethink taxation and to tax wealth. In some ways, what I've been trying to do, which I think very complementary to that strategy, is to rethink the wealth creation process itself. It's not enough to tax wealth. We need to rethink where the wealth came from. And if you look at that line where inequality rose so starkly, not just in the US, his book obviously tells us this story across the world. Since the 1970s, it's increased. It's fascinating to look at the different types of tax policies which increased inequality and how they were driven by stories, discourses, narratives about innovation and wealth creation. So Warren Buffett, who's not a communist, but very frankly says, I never even look at capital gains. Why did you reduce my capital gains tax by 50%? At the end of the 1970s, that only increased inequality. It didn't increase investment. That particular tax reduction was actually lobbied by the National Venture Capital Association in the US with this idea that we're the risk takers, we're the most important actors in the innovation economy. In order to get us to invest, you have to reduce our capital gains, which of course, massively increase profits, when actually their investments, if we look at them in biotech, nanotech, and green tech, have always followed this kind of active opportunity creation through direct investments of the public sector, not looking at, tax rates. And as Alicia mentioned, we've also been looking at what is actually done with the profits that are generated from this type of growth. Well, there's this huge issue out there that some people are reflecting on in terms of financialization. So Bill Azonic's work, again, has found that increasingly Fortune 500 big multinational companies, which of course operate across the globe, have been spending increasingly their profits on areas like share buybacks, which are aimed at increasing share prices, stock options, and executive pay. And one of the issues, besides throwing alarm at this, and the black line should alarm you because it's repurchases over R&D, is what does that mean for the kind of deals that are being struck between the public and the private sectors? Because what's interesting, when we actually look at some of the most important private sector companies that were willing to co-invest alongside the state in the big missions of the past, like Bell Labs or Xerox PARC, their investments came from a deal with the public sector. So it was actually the US government that got AT&T at the time to reinvest into the real economy, into innovation, big innovation, as opposed to, say, hoarding, which today is at record levels. In the US, it's $2 trillion being hoarded, so inert capital. In Europe, it's close to that. And across the world, there's not just this financialization problem, but this hoarding problem, so profits not being reinvested back into the real economy. That came from a deal, again, between the public and the private sector, because the monopoly, just like an IPR, patents, is not a right, it's a contract, right? And so what is the contract? What's the give and take? And I think, again, Keynes, another great quote, which hasn't been thought about enough, was this concept also of socialization of investment. He started thinking about the role of community banking and different types of tools that could also socialize investment. And I think it's important to reflect on this on terms of the deals that we could be constructing between public and private actors to create these dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic ecosystems. And there's all sorts of areas, whether it's, prices should reflect the public contribution, whether it's sometimes allowing public actors to retain equity or royalties to reflect this massive risk-taking, where for every Tesla, which received $465 million from the US government, there's a Solyndra, which received $500 million. Failure. Success, Tesla. failure Solyndra. Whether it means, as we were talking about today earlier with Alicia, retaining a golden share in the IPR in particular areas, especially where the patents are upstream on the research tools, whether it means thinking of serious dynamic portfolio investing in state investment banks that can again be used as a revolving fund to also finance the welfare state. Danny Roderick, who I know gave one of the previous Prebisch Cátedras, has picked up on that and wrote an article called From the Welfare State to the Innovation State, thinking of how we can sort of bring these two goals together by setting up these revolving funds. Anyway, all sorts of different ideas could be thrown in the table for that, but the main thing is to change that conversation, and the only way to do that is to start with this ridiculous cartoon image, which has to be rethought from the start precisely to enable this kind of mission-oriented objective to transplant the market failure objective. And I should say the market failure theory is useful. We shouldn't throw it out, but it's not useful for tackling these big challenges. We should use the insights from it, but it absolutely has to be complemented with the market-shaping, market-creating framework. And I really hope that by stimulating you around these issues, we can really work to also use this to set up the kinds of, again, dynamic partnerships in Latin America, which are required in order to get that co-investment process. This is not about, sorry, this is stopped again, big state versus small state or business versus government. It's absolutely about how to get a co-investment and new types of agreements reflect the directionality, which have different types of evaluation criteria, which build as opposed to destroy, which is what we have today, lots of public organizations just being cut rather than rethought, and which enable us to get new types of contracts, literally rethinking mechanism design, so we strike healthier deals that will benefit everyone in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mariana Mazzucato. I think you gave us a very insightful and very rich conference that I'm sure is stimulating and will stimulate new thinking in this house, at least. I'm sure it is already doing that. So let me open the floor for comments or questions. Let us have a first round. Maybe we can pick 2 or 3, and then if time permits, we can go to another round. So is anybody interested in asking a question? There we are. Please, if you can, do we have a mic there? And if you be so kind, here, Marta, aquí. If we can have you introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marion Capena. I'm the ambassador of the Netherlands here in Chile. Thank you very much for a really thought-provoking, innovative presentation, which set us all thinking, I'm sure. My question is around the concept which seems to be gaining momentum. We see more and more publications. It's also a very innovative thinking on fighting poverty, fighting inequality, empowering sustainable or more intelligent growth, and that's the concept of a basic income for everyone. And I wonder whether you could elaborate on that innovative new concept. Thank you.
Kei Jinaway from the International Trade Division here at ECLAC. Yeah, you spoke about the mission of reforming finance for inclusive growth. And that's also a mission here at ECLAC. And we see it as financing innovation for small and medium-sized enterprises. But in my division, since we're interested in trade, we look for financing innovation for SMEs to export. And I was wondering, you spoke about that the public sector needs to go beyond just de-risking and therefore attracting better human resources by changing their style. But I was wondering, have you thought about the role of maybe larger enterprises, of the large enterprises here? And then I'm thinking about the zaibatsu system in Japan, which luckily General MacArthur was not able to get rid of. So it's still alive and kicking. And as you know, zai means finance in Batsu's group. So these are financial groups. So I was wondering if you thought about the role of these larger enterprises to take the risks, part of the risks, and not that they should be financing themselves, but taking the risk by having the SMEs in an association with the larger enterprises, which, in Japan, it's the keiretsu, which are still alive and kicking. So I was wondering if this could be part of your model in order to be replicated in other areas of the world, including Latin America. And of course, it's not only the role of development banks. In Japan, as you know, there were the main banks also of each group that were also involved in financing innovation. So I was wondering whether you still think there is a role for larger enterprises. And by the way, I'm glad to see a fellow Tufts graduate here. So go Jumbos.
Thank you, KG. We have another question here from the rector of the Chile University, please.
Thank you very, very much for your talk. I wanted please to ask a comment on what you think should be the relationship between the public sphere and the university world, with some comment on the principles that should guide universities and the financial way of the universities. Anything that you may say could be extremely helpful for us, because here we are in a situation where we follow by the book, a chapter number 6 of a book that was written in 1962 by Milton Friedman, and which is inspiring in ideas that come from the late 40s. We have never got away beyond that, so we are still, intellectually speaking, in the Cold War here in Chile, okay, and on one side of the Cold War. So whatever you might give us an orientation that would put us even a step forward from that, we would be extremely appreciative. And thank you very, very much, because I was really moved at many parts of your talk. Thank you so much.
Very much for
the second round.
These excellent questions. And they're very deep. Why? So let me just take them in order. Basic income, which, by the way, some of the most interesting stuff on that, I think, is being written by some Minskians. So I don't know if you've seen the work of Stephanie Kelton and Randy Ray and others who've been working, actually, alongside Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in the U.S. on that topic, is really interesting because it builds, in some ways, on Amartya Sen's work on capabilities, right? That you can't even compete, you can't even enter the world of wanting to increase your own opportunities and make decisions on what sector you might want to work in or what you might want to do in life if you don't have some basic capabilities, whether they are around hygiene, whether they are around education, or whether your income is just so low that you're constantly just trying to survive and you can't really enter this wonderful world of decision making. And so the basic income, I think, hypothesis is fundamental in terms of how it should be seen as one of those basic capabilities, those basic, in some ways, human rights that people should not go under a certain level. Everyone should be given a basic income in order to then, be able to make these interesting choices we all have. What I find uncomfortable with it, which is not really how anyone has talked about it, but my own concern, is to move the progressive agenda from always about redistribution, which currently, that's how it's being discussed, to something which some have called pre-distribution, but then if you look at what was done around pre-distribution, I think it wasn't necessarily adequate, so let me think of a new word for it. I'll come up with the word later. But which is actually, again, coming back to this notion that we're only going to be able to really get a long-standing, basic income in the sense of really guaranteeing everyone with their human right of being able to act as a citizen in society and not having to fight for basic things which should be taken for granted, if we have a different concept of all the different actors which have actually been responsible to create wealth in the first place. By the way, workers, I didn't mention, right? I've kept talking about the public sector. Many workers today in new economy type jobs no longer have, for example, a guaranteed career, right, in an organization. So they might be willing to take on quite low wages or low salaries with the hope that they have a long-time career as they might have had under the old economy, but that's no longer true. So they should be seen as risk takers, right? And again, debunking that whole notion of who the risk takers are. But I think what's really important with the basic income work is to both nest it in terms of SEN's basic capabilities, which are required in order for people to pursue opportunities, but also not to allow it to be almost not captured, what's the word, contained within just a redistribution issue. It should be seen as a way to actually enable everyone to create value in the first place, which then, of course, also has to be redistributed, and progressive taxation has to happen. Regressive taxation is, a problem, and it just creates inequality. But by nesting it within a new understanding of value creation, I think is essential for it also to, to move forwards. So the second question about big, if you want, financial organizations, which also aren't clearly, public, just public, or also what they do in terms of changing the relationships between different financial actors. I think that's also extremely important. You alluded to one of, again, another cancer of today's capitalism, which is not just outsourcing, but the degree to which the financial sector in some countries, but also the global financial players, have been basically lending to themselves. That's one way that, people like Andy Haldane have talked about financialization. So the degree to which financial intermediation, seeing as the full sort of even shadow banking system, has globally completely outgrown in recent, sort of the last 20, 25 years, the growth of value-added everything but finance, say, in agriculture. And it's astounding. And why is that? Precisely because finance has not been playing the role that Minsky talked about, which is capital development of the economy. It's been financing itself. But then there's all sorts of examples, and some that you mentioned in Japan. What's happening today in China is fascinating, with the Chinese Development Bank and different big financial players in China even financing UK infrastructure, because no one else will finance it in the UK. And I think the issue for me is not whether that's good or that's bad, but for me it always comes back down to the organization. This is also why, what lessons can we learn from specific organizations? So you talked about the Japanese one, or what's happening today within the Chinese Development Bank. What can we learn about the sort of challenges? And one of the issues is, and this actually does benefit a lot from the systems of innovation perspective, that when you have sort of big blobs of finance or a big blob of investment from just a ministry sort of top down, we have seen that that tends to be a bit more problematic than when it's a decentralized network of different types of public actors which also are able to, I don't want to say specialize, meaning they get too provincial, but also to invest or create also indirect policies in specific areas which the people working in those funds or agencies have expertise on. So the China Development Bank today, just as an example, is a big public financial institution which not only gave huge amounts of money to Huawei, number one in the world in telecoms, but is backing huge players in the renewable energy sector. I usually put up the slide. The amount of money is like $9 billion to individual solar and companies, some of which fail, right? But so what's interesting is how those decisions are actually being managed. And it's not the number in itself. So Elon Musk got $5 billion from the US government. Most people don't know that, right? But that was through a distributed network of different types of public agencies, some like the Tesla loan through the DOE, others in terms of SpaceX through NASA, et cetera. I think these are the kind of questions that, at least for me, interest, or I think they're quite important, which is at the organizational level, what can we learn from the way that risks were welcomed, but also that these kind of revolving funds were structured. The US hasn't done that, and that's why today there's so much pressure to cut these organizations. And that actually brings me to the third question, and I'm sorry if I'm not spending more time on the second one, but otherwise we won't get other questions, which is how we value public organizations like universities. So interestingly, and I was just in Holland, where they have, for example, a process of valorization of the universities, right? Universities have to immediately show the economic value that they're producing. Similarly, by the way, as NASA even, or different public organizations in the US, or the BBC is having to, today, more than ever, show their economic value. And that's how they have to justify themselves. Hence, in the UK, we have the research assessment exercise, which has lots of benefits to it, but how we're actually measuring the impact that our research is having in the business community has been, if you want, debated. But NASA itself, it's interesting precisely because they didn't have these immediate short-term goals or, needs to show economic value within sort of 2, 3, or 5 years. They were able to think of it in terms of 30 years. That's precisely why they were successful at commercializing. I often give the example, and then no one laughs, but of sex, that when people obsess about sex because they can't sort of do it properly, then it's not going to happen, right? So we're obsessing about commercialization. We are obsessing about commercialization, and it's not working. Why? Because you're obsessing about it. Relax. I sometimes say think big, but then people think I'm saying a dirty joke. No, I'm not. I'm just think big, think of the mission, which is very interesting. Now, coming specifically to the universities, one problem that I see is that there should actually be quite a clearly but fuzzy defined division of labor, right? So one thing that the US has had is that early stage technology development continues to be done in companies. We're not forcing the universities to do that. In Europe, to copy the US model, we're increasingly asking universities to create spin-outs, most of which are crap. Just go buy them. Go buy some spin-outs in Silicon Valley and bring them back to Europe or something. It's going to be a better use of your money than making university research focused on creating spin-outs. That's one problem. A second problem is the technology transfer offices, which on the one hand you could say are trying to approach what I was talking about in terms of, allowing some public value to come back through retaining some sort of share. But actually, if you look at what they've done to universities, if they've, again, sort of made them obsessed with capturing that economic value versus rethinking, for example, how the patenting system today is also damaging the scientific process because we increasingly have patents upstream. The tools for research are being patented. We're going back to the Middle Ages. We're going back to secrecy in the world of big data and open innovation, yeah? And third, there's this misunderstanding between basic and applied. So many researchers fear the companies coming in and, influencing research in some way by focus on applied. That basic and applied research have always worked, interestingly, hand in hand, right? So it's not whether MIT or Santiago University are willing to take private money. There's lots of private money going into different university laboratories around the world. It's the degree to which then a university research agenda is able to remain also independent in terms of the basic research, foster the feedback between the basic and the applied. It's always the feedback between them that creates interesting things. But also in terms of what's interesting about these missions, going to the moon or the climate change mission, is they require a lot of basic research and a lot of applied research. So creating also these intermediary institutions that are well-financed, like the Fraunhofers in Germany, not badly financed, like the Catapult Centers in the UK, which copied the Fraunhofers, to create these dynamic serendipitous, if you want, linkages, but also not to fall into the trap of seeing it's basic versus applied. And this is one of the areas where this kind of mission-oriented financing can be interesting because it requires, again, both. But, we, of course, need independence of the scientific process, so that should always be fought for. But the last thing universities should do is, A, confuse the division of labor, so end up doing what the private sector should do, and also accept these immediate valorization tools, which end up killing your ability to, again, think big and to change the discourse in different interdisciplinary areas.
Thank you. Can we have another?
Yeah.
I think we had somebody there that wanted to ask a question. Marta. Remember just to say who you are.
Buenas tardes, soy Paula Muñoz de algunas organizaciones ambientales y mi pregunta va en la siguiente línea. Estamos en un modelo extractivista en donde en general las grandes corporaciones y la inversión se van en la línea de seguir extrayendo y contaminando nuestro planeta. Entonces nos ha llevado al borde del colapso en el tema medioambiental. Tenemos un cambio climático muy fuerte. ¿Cómo señalas tú de alguna manera este triángulo de la inversión del Estado versus el modelo extractivista y cómo, de alguna manera, las tecnologías verdes y cómo apuntamos hacia una innovación en el decrecimiento, no pensar tanto en el crecimiento, sino pensar en cómo logramos con lo que tenemos generar mejor inversión, crecimiento en las economías o en el bolsillo de las personas finalmente, pero con un planeta que tiene que ser resguardado.
We take another one here. Un gran amigo de la casa. Gracias, Eduardo, por estar aquí.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. On this issue that the principal of Universidad de Chile brought, the role of the university, and what you mentioned about that, we in Corfo are coming to the conclusion that in order to overcome or undertake these mission-oriented challenges more in the innovation and technology area, we have to recreate institutions that were destroyed during the liberalization, which is this kind of Fraunhofer-like type of institutions. Technology centers where you have researchers with the mission to do technology development and innovation, and to focus in collaboration with the private sector with a very clear mission to undertake a very, very clear and complex problems. Forcing the universities to take that role really distort the role of the universities. You have to have, I believe myself, that the German model of the Max Planck University model with basic research that interact with a more applied technology development. And many times, one tends to think in a more linear approach of innovation, which is not the case. Usually innovation comes, you pose a problem or you see the challenge, and then you go back to basic research to help you to undertake and to solve problems. But we have a missing link in many of the countries in Latin America, and I believe that we have to rebuild technology center or institutes that receive from a dialogue on looking at the future big challenges. And I could give you an example. Chile is a singular country. We have the most important, the most significant solar radiation of the world, even near Santiago, but in the north is the most important. The most important metallic district, mining metallic district of the world. The most important non-metallic district of the world, the lithium, and the driest desert of the world. And we have all this combination, then you need to do innovation programs to tackle these challenges and to create new opportunities. We post all these challenges in the universities alone, or we develop specialized technology institutions to work with in alliance to reduce and to also to share risk, to develop solar, hydrogen and oxygen for the mining sector to move into a green economy. And then we pose a challenge. We want to have the greenest mining economy of the world or sector of the world, because we have the sun, we have the hydrogen, we have from the sun. Is that a business just for universities, just for the companies? Or we create a new type of organization and we pose the challenge and we give the money, they have to look for additional resources also. That's a thought on this issue.
Wow, very interesting. One more and we close. There we are. Oh my goodness, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. We might take the 4. That's okay?
Yeah, or should we? Otherwise I'll forget.
That's right. One more and then another round. All right. So here, Alvaro, and then we go for another round and we stop there. You guys and then somebody there.
Good morning. Thank you for your very nice presentation. I would like to ask, how to tackle with choosing priorities, because mission-oriented policy means to choose priorities. So how do you tackle with that, with the political economy of choosing and sustaining those priorities through time? Because we're talking here of 10 to 15 to 20 years working with a priority and with a mission-oriented where all the science and technology and innovation effort goes to solution problems of very important priorities for a country. That's a question.
Back to you, Mariana, for these three, and then we go back to another three.
So I definitely do not believe in degrowth, or, I think that's a luxury that, we might not, or we sitting in this room who are relatively well off might not suffer from, but the unemployed of this world and those people who are not receiving, on that path of, as we were saying before, having those basic capabilities, will not benefit from a degrowth strategy. What's required, which I think goes then in the vein of what you were actually implying, is a fundamental rethink on how to change the direction of the growth. It's not enough just to stimulate startups or stimulate science or stimulate enterprise zones or whatever it is a nation might do to have growth. We have to have serious debates about the direction. That's why I began with that whole issue of directionality and, what kind of growth do we want? And you were basically focusing, rightly so, because we only have some years we can tackle this, the sustainability and the green growth, let's call it that challenge. But to me, it's endogenous. Just like the term secular stagnation, which is a trendy word that people use, but it's always flavored with this exogenous tint of it's somehow the savings behavior in the advanced countries, or it's the inevitable decrease in what we can still, if you want, discover because most innovations have been discovered, or different types of relationships between developed and developing countries, the emerging ones versus the developed ones. Secular stagnation is a result of problems that we currently have in terms of the way that public and private actors are acting, right? And then how that influences our ability to kickstart investments in green is fundamental. So overly financialized private sector, so we don't have the Bell Labses in energy as we did in IT. The big energy companies are the most financialized of all the companies. Pharmaceuticals are second, but energy's first. And you ask them, why aren't you reinvesting your profits in all these great areas that can present us with more sustainable growth in the future? There's no opportunities, they say. Same thing the pharmaceutical companies say. Of course there's opportunities. You've just decided not to invest, and we have weak, scared, non-confident states not demanding the investment of these companies in exchange for the massive amounts of subsidies and different types of also investments that the energy companies are receiving from the state. However, recently in Paris, of course, there were some advances. No? There was, in the COPs agreement, two things that happened. 20 billion that will be spent by the private sector through the breakthrough initiative of Zuckerberg and Gates. And then, of course, this mission organization that is more the countries themselves having pledged another 20 billion. But there, too, that's not enough, and that actually comes to the third question, but I might approach that second and then come back to the second one which is who's making the decisions, right? Is it right that a bunch of billionaires, who also, of course, have evaded huge amounts of taxes, then make decisions on where these energy investments go? And I had the privilege to spend a whole day with Bill Gates recently, and he's great. He's one of the few that says, government must lead, we will follow. He even goes as far as saying the private sector is inept in energy. Government must do for IT what it did for energy. But then there's two issues there. One is his own company is an extremely financialized one, Microsoft, which isn't through his company, forget his charity, investing in these kinds of challenges, but also his own money and that of other billionaires. How should we make those decisions, even when you have these big amounts that come out for investing in renewable energy? Should it be the pet projects, the great ideas that a particular rich or not rich person thinks, or should there be a peer review as well, for example, for these big pots of money, precisely because, again, their own profits, which are then being dedicated to these areas, have themselves come out of, as I said before, a collective process, but these decisions on where to invest private money in such an important challenge should itself undergo a bit more scrutiny than just fulfilling, again, one person's or two people, there's not that many of them, I think there's 5 of them right now, wish list of great technologies. But also, and I mentioned this before, the different types of taxation policies that we don't have around energy, or the same with the financial sector. After a financial crisis, there was all sorts of things we could have done to direct that sector in a particular way, to make it more long-term focused, not short-term focused, like the financial transactions tax, which never came about. There's similar types of policies in energy which we still don't properly have, like carbon taxes. Where I differ with carbon taxation is that would at best solve the incertitude and the signals for the private investors. What they also need, if you want, is this co-investment, which creates a new area, which then they follow, but also better deals, because they will benefit from those investments, again, to be replugged in. And I think all these examples I just gave are about redirecting that growth process in a way that helps us, both public and private, steer investments in an area which simply are not coming. In terms of how we make choices, that's really important in this. So many people don't realize, but even shale gas and fracking was government financed for decades before the private sector came in. Was that good? Was that bad? Well, as an economist, I'm not one to tell you. What my point is precisely because we've dismissed the role of the public sector, we then don't understand its market-shaping, market-creating roles, and hence we haven't even put in place those kinds of institutions which can also check to make sure we're not doing really stupid things. So it's not that shale was bad, but it was massively transformative, and in fact it ended up biasing or restructuring the investment portfolio of the US government, which up till then had actually started to really reinvest across a diverse set of renewable energy. And then because they really succeeded around fracking, again, highly publicly financed, they ended up narrowing down that portfolio. So one of the big issues for me is diversity, that you want to retain when you're making these different choices, a diversity within the portfolio, not putting all your eggs in one basket. Shale gas has sort of become one big egg that the economy is focused on. It's had a distortionary effect on the other investments. And these issues around diversity and indicators of diversity of public financing is crucial. Andy Sterling at SPRU, this is an area he's working on, and he has even thought of indicators for diversity of investments from public budgets, precisely because it's a public budget. We need to understand the direction that it's taking, and we will only have that when we admit this transformational role of these public funds. In terms of these institutions, I mean, I could simply say I completely agree with you. You really said it very eloquently, actually. And you began, or at some point you said there's a non-linear innovation chain. That's the first point. As soon as you start thinking, fund a lot of science, and somehow over time it's going to create commercialization, we know the dangers of that. But it's also true that precisely because we've talked about all these non-linearities, we've gone overboard. We really have gone overboard. We've ended up focusing so much on these intermediary actors, which I was mentioning in the beginning, in the European Commission, for example. It's all about framework conditions and these partnerships and institutions where those partnerships might happen, which, as important as they are, we have to be careful we don't end up pushing on a string. What are they actually commercializing if we've at the same time defunded things like, and I don't want to obsess about it, but public laboratories, which we used to have. What CERN does, which is one of the only big public laboratories we have left, could be used also for all sorts of different areas, including immigration challenges, right? It doesn't have to be just natural sciences. We no longer have much faith in some of these public institutions, so this facilitating role has sort of almost gone overboard. Having said that, because it is important, this horizontal linkages, which comes from the systems of innovation approach, learning on why those that were successful is also important. So Fraunhofer's, for example, someone once told me that the reason that they are so successful in doing what they do is not just the classic case of playing a role where the private and the public sector meet to solve different solutions that are relevant to a sector, but the same person goes from being a sort of a civil servant to working in the private sector. It breaks down that cartoon image of Kafka and Zuckerberg. It breaks it down. So it changes how people talk. It changes the kinds of solutions when they go to the table. And one of my favorite people nowadays is Maurizio Landini, who's the head unionist, trade union leader in Italy for metal mechanic workers. He's metal mechanic, so he does Fiat, Ducati. Ducati was bought by the Germans. So he tells me what his experience is like in Italy at the negotiating table. You have business, government, and the trade unions, and what the negotiating table is like in Germany, because he has Ducati, so he goes to the German negotiating table. He says it's a completely different conversation. In Italy, he's lucky if he even gets invited to the table. But I strongly believe that those different ways in which, if you want, corporate governance structures in Germany are formed and the variety of capitalism that Germany has chosen is also influenced by these concrete organizations that they form and what they do to the kind of narrow provincial way that we sometimes think of what it is to be government, business, or university, et cetera. And that is just as important as learning the lessons. And just lastly, what you said about mining is so important. It's what I've been telling the UK government, which just lost its steel industry, right? Tata Steel is closing and 45,000 jobs are at stake. It's not about steel as, good or bad industry, should we let it die? It's how little investment has been made in the UK on revitalizing steel, as you were talking about revitalizing mining. So Germany, for example, doesn't just use virgin steel. They recover, repurpose, reuse, recycle steel. That's been nested within their energy van policy. Steel has become an interesting vehicle through which to achieve that mission. It's exactly what you just said about mining. It's very important because otherwise we fall back on the static thing of, oh, that's a good sector, that's a bad sector, this is high-tech and new economy, that's old-style resource extraction. Every sector can be revitalized, but only if you have a strategy which has to be a result of an innovation policy. God, I talk a lot.
Very good. Three. Okay, three. Very quick, please.
Yeah, hi.
We've finished this round.
My name is Andres Midnik. I'm from the Ministry of Economy's Strategic Investment Fund. And my question is regarding how to share the revenues from the government spending. And in that regard, here in Chile, the entrepreneurial state is banned by the Constitution, but that could hopefully change in the near future. So I was wondering, one of the ways you said, or you mentioned that this could change was by the government to have equity, even equity in companies. And traditional economic language tells us that there's all sorts of problems when you have public officials sitting in the boards of companies. So I was wondering if you could delve further into how could the government add value while being an equity holder in a company and participating in a board. And I don't want you to get too technical, but I think these are areas where the devil is in the details. So thank you.
Hi, Mariana. Thank you for your excellent lecture. And my question is, in your point of view, which would be a good way to connect this new deal between the private and the public sector with the new trade agenda, the global agenda, focused on the new trade mega blocks such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the negotiation of the TIIP, understanding that the private sector in the European case is a powerful group of interest because there are lobbying in such many ways. So what's your opinion in this case?
I'm not sure if you were, the first question, I'm not sure, where are you again? I need to look at you. There you are, okay. I'm not sure if you were challenging or accepting the assumption that somehow government actors wouldn't be good sort of equity investors, but let me just sort of lay out quickly the argument. The point is there's different experiences across the globe, whether we look at Finland, Israel, the US, et cetera, on different ways in which a public return has been discussed. I mentioned in the US this was also done through the price mechanism, or the AT&T investment was a way for the public to get back a return because the idea was you reinvest your profits, that will increase the jobs and the taxation revenue of the government. Taxation, of course, used to be one of the ways we thought about that public return. We know, obviously, lots has happened to tax to not enable it too much to work that way, not just because of tax evasion, tax avoidance, but even the tax rates themselves. I mentioned capital gains tax. The upper marginal rate under Eisenhower, a Republican military general who founded NASA, was over 90%. Okay, we don't live in that world anymore, right? So this is why I suggest us to open our minds to rethink how these returns may occur. They also are often assumed to occur through spillovers, but precisely because we're patenting the tools for research, the even natural spillover process of public investment is potentially being blocked. Anyway, there is an experience, and one of them is retaining equity. Now, the question is how? So in the Tesla arrangement, it was crazy. The government would have only had the right for 3 million shares in the company had the Tesla loan gone bad. I mean, how stupid is that? So basically, only if the company fails, you give the government a slice, which brings us to the usual thing of public bad, private good, right? Anytime a bank gets, goes into public hands, when it goes back into the market, the toxic debt remains in the public hands, or when Alitalia got privatized, the bad company remained in government, good company goes to the private sector. So we're deeply entrenched in this public bad, private good. In the Tesla example, where the US government could only have 3 million shares, if the loan was not paid back, and the loan was paid back is an example. By the way, the price per share went from 9 to 90 between 2009 to 2013, and of course the loan was paid back. So the point is, why should the government have the right to equity in this particular case, or something else? And that's precisely because for every Tesla you'll have 10 Cylindras, which was a loss. So because the tax system itself is not working necessarily to allow that, we need to rethink this. Now, why it is that a civil servant or a government official is necessarily going to have issues with that, I'm not sure what you mean. If you're referring to being captured, for example, yeah? Yeah. Okay, so those are really important questions, and they can be managed. They can be managed. I don't think there's anything in the DNA of the government that would prevent it from finding sort of a solution to that. But especially in terms of the capture issue, I do want to mention something. There's so much evidence of capture precisely when government doesn't think this way, when to be business friendly means to introduce, pretty problematic tax policies. We talked yesterday about the patent box, which was lobbied into government by GlaxoSmithKline. It's a tax policy that is incredibly ineffective. It targets the profits earned from a patent versus the research that leads to it, has no effect on investment, just increases or decreases the government revenue. And that's lobbied for by a company in a government that has no idea what its role is, where being business friendly means, serving different sectors or different businesses, and that creates a really problematic kind of relationship. Whereas retaining equity, that's about stakeholder capitalism too, right? Not shareholder capitalism, stakeholder capitalism. There's lots to learn from different experiences. That's not sort of my place to tell, governments exactly what formula to follow, but there's, lots of different ways that can happen, including retaining a golden share, again, of the IPR, the patents, including retaining royalties. That's how YASMA, a public venture capital fund in Israel, works. In Finland, there's different types of public innovation funds that have retained equity, and they've worked quite well, of course, with some failures. And the real issue was the question that was raised before, and how to maintain that diversity of portfolio decisions so you're not really skewing the economy in whatever way towards just, a particular area. Right, new trade. It's hard to say anything very sensible about that, except that it's such a race to the bottom in terms of how it's currently structured. But what I find curious is that whereas so many people have attacked TTIP for good reasons, there's some very interesting work by Jim Stanford in Canada, who's looking at the effect it's going to have also on workers, actually, in Canada, and reflecting on the NAFTA agreement as an example and comparing them, and et cetera, is how what we don't realize is how this race to the bottom is actually so much more diffuse than this international agreement around TTIP. The same problems that have been highlighted on why TTIP is going to be a problem are the same that we're currently witnessing in terms of a revival almost of enterprise zone kind of mentality across the world, where to attract capital, it's all about, again, reducing different types of impediments, especially around tax, which are fundamental. If you want a mission-oriented set of public agencies, you better make sure you know where the money's going to come from. And either you create it through the endogenous money idea, you can create money, but if you're going to require it from tax revenue, be careful that all these tax policies we're introducing as a race to the bottom. Just look at Ireland, Holland. Holland is extremely problematic in its tax policy, but also these kind of patent box tax policies. They are a race to the bottom. And I think I'm just raising that in the sense that I think there's been enough interesting things that people have said against the way that, whether it's NAFTA or TTIP, were structured. And what's useful there is to always see them in a market-shaping view. So what is it we're even trying to get, right? So the market is an outcome. It's not like the boogeyman, the market is here and imposing terrible things that we need to do. Markets are outcomes of interactions between different types of agents, public sector agents, private sector agents, and also civil society pressures, which historically have always steered things in ways which have benefited us, like an 8-hour workday or all sorts of other things. So the question is, what is the outcome we're going for, and how do we structure these interactions between these different agents in a way that gets us there, right? And that should then inform these rules around, will that particular structuring of the TTIP and those arrangements help us get to a more inclusive and smart innovation-led growth in different countries, or will it simply allow short-term profits to rule over long-term sort of growth agendas? And of course, as it's currently structured, it's that. But what the left or the progressive, if you want, colleagues, I think, need to do is to reverse that. So instead of just tackling TTIP and then letting, not even knowing what the patent box is, to really, again, think of all these things, including IPR, not as a right, but it's a contract. We need to structure the contract to get us the market outcomes we want, instead of what Baumol called, for example, unproductive entrepreneurship.
Thank you very much, Mariana. I think you have done a great job. I think you answered all the questions. I think we can have an interaction. We're going to have a reception out there for those of you who would like to talk to you more personally. But I really want to highlight that you are giving us enormous amount of, I would say, thinking to do homework, to do in this house, in particularly in ECLAC. I think we have to really rethink wealth creation, rethink the public value. I love really the way you are phrasing the new, I would say, the new trend that we have to follow to really find a new forms of growth, actually, with inclusion, with innovation, with job creation. So I think we are basically sharing a lot of things. We are going to work together. So for those of you young researchers that would like to join the joint work we're going to do with Mariana, you're very invited to do so. We are going to work on the realm, the public-private realm, for innovation and for and to start a new conversation. I think this is new deals, new conversations. This is what we need.
Can I just say one thing on
Sure.
this? I shouldn't interrupt, Alicia.
No,
but
you
there's
should.
heterogeneity in the business community. Within telecoms, there's Ericsson and Huawei, which do reinvest their profits. Cisco doesn't. So this is also important. And evolutionary economics always pointed to heterogeneity, but then didn't take it one step further, which is let's take advantage of those businesses that do want to have this conversation.
That's exactly what I want to suggest and to propose, because you have circuits, we have other circuits. We have to identify those private companies, agencies that are willing to enter into this new thinking, new conversation, and also the public agencies such as Corfo, the universities. I mean, we have to start the whole thing to enter into this mission that you are inviting us to do. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for all of you staying on a little bit. We're going to have a little bit of champagne with Mariana. I think she deserves that. Thank you very much.